the moment she dumped the black woman's food into the trash and laughed. Nobody in that restaurant realized they had just humiliated someone who didn't need to raise her voice to end careers. The waitress laughed as she swept the black woman's untouched meal into the trash. 10 seconds later, the restaurant doors opened, and 6 men in black suits stepped inside. But no one was looking at them yet. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on the woman sitting alone by the window. She looked elegant without trying to impress anyone. A navy blazer rested neatly over her shoulders. A book lay open beside her glass of water. She had entered quietly, smiled at the hostess, and ordered dinner like every other customer in the room. Then her plate arrived. She glanced at it and gently raised her hand. "I'm sorry," she said warmly. "I think this may have been meant for another table." The waitress didn't even try to hide her irritation. "You people always find something wrong," she said. Under her breath, several customers looked up. The woman blinked but remained calm. "I only asked because I didn't order this." The waitress rolled her eyes dramatically, snatched the plate away, and returned moments later, wearing the same expression of annoyance. "You know what?" she said loudly. "Forget it." Then she dumped the food into the trash. A few diners gasped. The waitress laughed as though she had just won an argument. The woman stared at the empty table in front of her. She looked embarrassed for only a moment. Then she straightened her posture and folded her hands. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply asked, "Was that really necessary?" The waitress smirked. She had already decided exactly who this woman was. Near the entrance, someone reached for a phone, sensing something unforgettable was beginning, and that assumption was about to become the biggest mistake of her life. A few minutes earlier, the restaurant had felt perfectly ordinary. The woman had entered alone, carrying herself with quiet confidence. She wasn't wearing anything flashy. There were no introductions, no demands, no effort to draw attention. She simply smiled at the hostess and accepted a small table near the window. The waitress approached with an expression that suggested she had already made up her mind. "What'll it be?" she asked flatly. The woman thanked her and placed a simple order. Instead of writing it down, the waitress sighed and looked around the room as if something more important deserved her attention. "Busy night," she muttered. "You'll have to wait." The woman nodded politely. "That's perfectly fine." Other customers noticed the exchange. A couple sitting nearby exchanged glances. An older man lowered his newspaper and watched for a moment before returning to his meal. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Tables that had arrived after her were served first. Still, the woman said nothing. When the waitress finally returned with a glass of water, the woman smiled. "Thank you." The waitress looked almost annoyed by her kindness. She interpreted patience as weakness. She saw courtesy and assumed there would be no consequences. At last, a plate arrived. The woman looked down and immediately realized it wasn't what she had ordered. She gently raised her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I think there's been a mistake." The waitress's face hardened. "A mistake?" she repeated loudly. "Seriously, I may have received someone else's order." The waitress laughed bitterly. "Nothing's ever good enough, is it?" The room grew quiet. "I'm not complaining," the woman replied. "I just wanted to let you know." But the waitress had already decided this customer was the problem. She snatched the plate from the table. "You know what? Forget it." Then she turned and dumped the entire meal into the trash. A few people gasped. Someone whispered, "Did she really do that?" Near the entrance, a young man slowly pulled out his phone and pressed record. The woman looked at the empty place setting and then back at the waitress. Her voice remained calm. "Are you sure that's how you'd like to handle this?" The waitress laughed again. For the first time, several diners weren't looking at the waitress anymore. They were looking at the woman, wondering why she seemed completely unshaken by such cruelty under pressure. Then the front door opened, and every conversation in the restaurant suddenly stopped. 6 men in dark suits entered the restaurant without rushing, without speaking, but carrying an authority that changed the air the moment they stepped inside. Every conversation died instantly. Forks paused mid-air. Chairs stopped moving. Even the background music fell suddenly to quiet, as if the room itself understood something important had shifted. The men scanned the room once, precise and controlled, until their attention locked onto the woman sitting by the window. Then they moved toward her together. The waitress froze. Her face shifted as recognition flickered across her expression. These were not strangers. These men belonged to the world she had only heard about in rumors and headlines. One of the bodyguards stepped forward and spoke calmly, his voice respectful but firm. "Mum, is everything all right?" The entire restaurant held its breath. The waitress quickly tried to speak, but no sound came out at first. Panic replaced arrogance as she realized she was no longer in control of the situation. The woman remained composed, her hands folded, her expression steady. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding," she said quietly. The bodyguards noticed the plate in the trash and exchanged a brief glance that said everything without words. Whispers spread instantly through the room. "Who is she?" someone muttered. "Why does she have security?" Another voice asked. The waitress backed away slightly, trying to explain herself, but every word sounded weaker than the last. From the corner, the man who had been recording lifted his phone higher, capturing everything. One notification was already being posted online. Restaurant staff began gathering near the kitchen entrance, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. The contrast in the room became undeniable. Dignity on one side, panic on the other. The woman still had not raised her voice, but everything around her was beginning to fall apart. Then one of the bodyguards reached for his phone as it began to ring. He looked at the screen, his expression tightening slightly. The entire restaurant noticed Dot, and in that moment, everything was about to change again. He lifted the phone slowly, listening carefully, while the room remained frozen in silence. A few seconds passed that felt like minutes to everyone watching. The waitress whispered something to a co-worker, but even she no longer sounded confident. The bodyguard ended the call and looked toward the woman with a controlled seriousness. He nodded once, slowly, then he spoke, and every person in the room braced for what would happen next. The silence grew heavier as the truth was about to be revealed. No one moved yet. The bodyguard held the phone with steady hands, waiting for final confirmation that had just come through. He stepped forward and respectfully placed it into the woman's hand. She took it without hesitation and brought it to her ear, her expression unchanged, her voice calm and controlled as she spoke briefly, saying only what needed to be said before handing it back. Within moments, the restaurant manager rushed out from his office, drawn by urgency he could not explain yet. The second his eyes landed on the woman, his entire expression collapsed into recognition and shock. He knew exactly who she was. Whispers turned into disbelief as the truth began to surface. She was not just another customer. She was a respected entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a major investor in community programs that supported struggling neighborhoods and small businesses. Her name carried weight in spaces these diners had never imagined. The manager quickly understood the situation had spiraled far beyond a simple mistake. He turned toward the staff, then toward the waitress, piecing together fragments of what had just happened. Every detail now felt heavier with meaning. The recording from earlier had already begun spreading online. Phones lit up across the restaurant as notifications started to appear. What had been private humiliation was now becoming public exposure. The waitress stood frozen, her confidence completely gone. For the first time, she realized this moment might not disappear. She tried to step forward, her voice shaking as she attempted an apology, but it sounded hollow even to herself. The woman did not interrupt. She simply listened, her calmness cutting through the tension more sharply than anger ever could. The restaurant fell into absolute silence. No one dared to speak. No one even breathed loudly. Everyone expected anger, punishment, or humiliation in return. A wave of murmurs swept across the room as people struggled to process what they were hearing. Some guests slowly lowered their phones, realizing the moment had shifted from drama to consequence. The manager looked between the staff, and the woman again, trying to understand how things had escalated so quickly. The waitress swallowed hard, her earlier confidence completely replaced by fear. She could no longer hide. Even the kitchen staff had stopped moving, watching from the doorway as the situation unfolded in silence. The woman remained still, her presence calm enough to silence every accusation around her. A few seconds felt longer than minutes to everyone watching the unfolding moment. No one in the restaurant could look away anymore. Everything was about to collapse into truth in the next moment. But the woman didn't say what anyone expected, and her next words would become the real lesson of the night. The silence in the restaurant finally broke, but not in the way anyone expected. The waitress's voice cracked first as she stepped forward, her eyes red, her hands trembling. She tried to speak through tears. She could no longer hold back. "I'm sorry," she repeated, again and again, as if saying it more times could somehow undo what had already been done. The manager stood beside her, also apologizing, his voice heavy with regret, trying to explain how quickly everything had escalated without control. But the woman did not look angry. She did not look satisfied either. She simply listened, as if weighing every word with quiet understanding. The bodyguards remained still, watching without interference, their presence now less intimidating and more like silent witnesses to a moment that had already passed its breaking point. When the room finally settled, the woman spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and carried in a way that made every person lean in without realizing it. "Respect should never depend on someone's status," she said. "Nobody should need security, wealth, or influence just to be treated with basic decency." She paused, letting the words sink in. Then she looked directly toward the waitress. "You didn't know who I was," she said softly. "That's exactly why this matters." A strange stillness followed, not the silence of fear, but the silence of realization. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down, others nodded without speaking. The weight of what had happened was no longer about one woman, it was about every assumption ever made in rooms like this. A few customers began to clap slowly, then more joined in, not for drama, but for the truth they could not ignore. The man who had recorded everything stepped forward and quietly said he would share the full story, not as outrage, but as a reminder of dignity. The waitress, still shaken, admitted she had judged the woman only by appearance and assumed she had no consequence. Her words came out broken, but honest. The woman accepted the apology without pride or cruelty. Instead, she gently encouraged reflection, not punishment, and asked only that the lesson not be forgotten. The manager immediately announced mandatory customer service training and accountability changes for staff, acknowledging that respect could not be optional in any workplace. By the time the story reached the outside world, it was not the security that defined it, but the restraint, the dignity, and the calm response that refused to become cruelty in return. Because in the end, the 6 bodyguards weren't the most powerful people who walked into that restaurant that night.